probably stay home and also have a mobile, and also be a mobile student temporarily. Alright, alright, you didn't have any homework because it was Wednesday. We don't have anything to review because we literally just started introducing this yesterday. So let's go ahead and let's get into it on page 34. So we're in chapter 2, we're talking about plants. Now, why are plants important? I talked about this very loosely yesterday. Alright.
Because they use oxygen.
Use oxygen, and then what else? Flynn. Good job with another one. Jaden?
They make food for us.
Good job. Those are the 3 major reasons for it. What do you call a scientist that studies plants, Stevie?
A botanist.
A botanist. And then what is the study of plants, Scott? Botany. Alright, who was the botanist we talked about in your textbook? Alright, Lance. Good job. So Christian Conrad Schringel. So make a note of him. So he's weird. His name is kind of weird. So just make a note for him that he did a lot of working with plants, and he did a lot of working in particular trying to study them. All right. Yes, Hayden.
One, the Springle spelled with the P, and 2.
Oh, thank you. I must have actually bumped the wrong letter whenever I did it.
And 2 is Christian his actual name.
Mhm. You fix that really quick. I must have bumped the wrong letter when I was setting you up. Now it's fixed. All right. Thank you for that. All right, just make a note of that. So Christian Conrad Schringel, make a note for him. I think that's where we left off yesterday. So just make a note that Schringel, he intended to bring glory to God for the wise design, purpose, and provision he placed in his living creation. Now, he was a Christian. A lot of cases we think of scientists as not being Christians today, because a lot of them aren't Christians today, which is sad. But a lot of the early scientists, not all of them are Christians, but there was a lot of good people that were Christians, and they also studied science. So you don't have to choose between science and the Bible. That's the idea a lot of students have today, that you have to pick whether or not you want to do science or if you want to believe the Bible. You can do both. And so these early scientists, partly because they were studying the scriptures, made them want to study and notice the world around them. As a side note, anyone know what type of flowers these are? Anyone recognize these? All right, Jaden? You raised your hand, Jaden.
Gonna say Daisy, but I know it's wrong.
I thought it.
Japanese.
You think Japanese magnolia? They're pretty, but they're not these. So they're typically those bright, kind of purplish, pinkish flowers. But you're right that they are really pretty and really bright. All right. Oh, you had your hand up. You still want it?
I'm just gonna say Dano.
All right.
That's my
Yes.
favorite flower. Mom?
No. All right. What?
Looking.
Daisies?
Yeah.
No. All right.
Oh!
Wait.
I don't know why you're looking at the book. I didn't get the pictures out of the book.
Oh.
Nope. I don't know if they're in your book or not. I just went because I like these because we have these on my property. So I went and I took, well, I didn't take pictures of these, but I went and found photos of them. These are dogwood. The
I should know that.
dogwood.
We literally have that tree in front of our house.
Now, they're probably not blooming right now. They bloom in early spring. So if you didn't recognize the flowers, it's okay. You can tell dogwoods typically because they have these little red kind of divots. Technically, these aren't the petals. We'll talk about what these are called later on, but they look like the petals. So a lot of students and a lot of people think that they're the petals. Technically, they're not. Okay.
I know what they are.
I just told you. But they're
Dogwood.
dogwood.
No, I know what the.
Oh, okay, yeah. What do you call those?
I think you call them sequels. Thanks.
Very close. Do you have another name for them because they look so much like petals?
Replaceables.
No, not quite. It's okay. It's not in your book yet, so we'll talk about it. So don't worry about it. All right. So different parts of a flower. So God created an incredible variety of designs in flowers. These are the basic parts of a flower. Your book is using the plum flower because it has all of the parts on it, so it's a good example. But there are so many different types of flowers. Flowers can have a bunch of different structures, a bunch of different appearances as to how the parts look. Like a plum flower and a rose and a dogwood all look entirely different. So your book's pointing out that, okay, this is what we call a typical flower, but that just means that it has the parts that it's easy to see. So that's the reason why your book is using it, but as you go throughout, you're going to see there's a lot of variety in flowers. God just didn't make just one type of flower and call it done. He made a whole bunch of variety of different types of them. Alright, so all the flower's parts are involved in its primary function, the reproduction of the plant. Now remember, what is the purpose of reproduction, Scott? What happens if you have an organism that can't reproduce? What's going to happen to it? It'll go extinct. So its primary purpose is for reproduction, is to basically make the new organisms or make the new offspring. Because if it can't reproduce, it's going to die. You're going to have an extinct organism. So that's the primary purpose of the flowers. is involved in reproduction. It needs to be fertilized, or it needs to be able to make the baby plant for it. Alright, so going through the different parts really quick. So if you want to mark on your book on page 35, the parts as we go through them, you really want to know them. We haven't done any labeling like for diagrams yet, but you want to know this really well. Alright, so there are the female parts and the male parts of the flowers, and like we talked about yesterday, how a lot of flowers have both, and that's okay. So that way flowers, they can pollinate themselves in some cases, so that they can make the seeds and they can make the fruit for it. So the female part of the flower is the pistil. So make a note of that, pistil. That's the female part. There are 3 parts to the female parts of the flower. You have the stigma at the top. You have the style that holds it up. It's kind of like a long stem. And then you have the ovary down at the bottom. And this picture looks kind of weird, but the ovary is the whole rounded base down here. So that's all of the ovary. The ovule is on the inside, and the ovule, that's what contains the eggs. Just make a note that the pistil, there's 3 parts to it. The sticky part, top is the stigma. The rounded bottom is the ovary. And then the style is what holds it up. Kind of how like you might think like a pencil, kind of like a style you might use on like your iPad or maybe on your iPhone, the stick that you use to type things. You might think of that as, okay, that's the stick part. The stigma is sticky, so that might help you to remember, okay, that's the top part of it. And then ovary, that's the female part, where the ovules or the eggs are on the inside. So those are the female parts of the flower. So make a note of all of those. We'll talk about superior versus inferior in just a second. That's on the next slide. Where are you going, Jaden? Okay, go to page 35, so you can mark in your book. Alright, so the male part of the flower is the stamen part. So that's this part, for this word down here. There are 2 parts to it, so that's a little bit easier. You have the anther and the filament. So the anther is the portion at the top. It's making the pollen, or it's where the pollen is located on it. So that way it tries to spread out that pollen as much as possible. The filament is what holds it up. So this is kind of like the style for the pistil to hold it up. But over here, the filament is what holds the anther portion upward. So that way, the pollen gets either knocked onto bees and insects, or the wind blows and tries to scatter the pollen as much as possible. Because remember, the pollen contains the sperm cells for the male part of the flower, so that way it can make a future seed. So it needs to be able to have the pollen to reach the stigma, either in one flower, or it might be with cross-pollination, where you have 2 different flowers for it. So just make a note, stamen, male part of the flower, has the anther and the filament. There's also other parts of a flower. Now the petals are probably the easiest part of a flower. The petals are typically the showy, bright colored portion. So if you have a rose, typically, like you might see them as red, but they can be other colors as well. That's the showy portion. So make a note, petals, they're used typically to attract insects to them, to try to get the insect's attention to say, hey, come here, this is where the nectar is located, and whenever the pollinators come to get the nectar, in a lot of cases they'll bump into the anther portion and knock the pollen off. So that's why God designed it so that way a lot of flowers produce nectar. That way bees and moths or wasps in some cases will come and actually pollinate. Sepals, these are kind of like special leaves. Sometimes they can be other colors. But these sepals, they help protect the flower as it's developing. Whenever you have a baby flower or a bud of a flower, if it gets broken then, what's going to happen to it? Lynn? It'll die. So the sepals are kind of like extra covering that helps protect it as the flower is growing and developing. Once the flower opens and it's ready to be pollinated, the sepals aren't used as much anymore. But just make a note though that the sepals are there. A receptacle, that's the base of the flower, so that's kind of like the bottom. It helps hold all the flower parts together. If the receptacle gets damaged, it can fall or get broken or get messed up. So just make a note, receptacle, this helps hold the whole flower upright. Alright, so we talked through them. We'll show you a picture in a minute to show you some of the other parts of it. But just make a note that you know this picture in your book, all the different parts really well. Alright, we're going to talk about inferior versus inferior really quick. So a superior ovary, that is an ovary that's above, and that is above most of the other flowering parts. Make a note of that in your book, that is superior. This is attached above the other flower parts like your petals or your sepals. So in some cases it's attached like this where the ovary is above it. Superior just means above. It doesn't mean like it's better than the other ones. It just means that it's just above it. Inferior has to do with it's below like the petals or the other flower parts. So this is an inferior ovary. So inferior versus superior just refers to their position. So it doesn't mean like this one's better than this ovary. It's just referring to, okay, where is it at in the flower? So if you have a ovary that's below the other flower parts, it's inferior. If it's above the other flower parts, it's superior. So going back to this one, since this one is above the base of the flower part, so the receptacle and the petals are all down here, so this ovary is above it. So would this be an example of a superior ovary or an inferior ovary? Jaden. If it's above it?
Oh, if it's above it, it'd be superior.
Superior. So that's what I was saying, that this ovary is above the base down here, the receptacle and the sepals and the petals. They cut it away so that way you can see what it looks like on the inside, but the ovary is above the other petals and sepals. So this one would be considered a superior ovary because it's above it. Now some flowers have different designs. So it'd be a little, so some other flowers, as you look at them, you'll see that some of them are inferior and some of them are some of them are superior. Alright, some flowers only have the female structures of the flower and they don't have the male parts of the flowers. It just depends on the type of flower or the type of tree. Some trees, they only make the female flowers. Some trees only make the male flowers. It just depends on the type of tree and how God designed it. If you have a tree or a plant that only has the stamens or the male part of the flower, we call it a staminate flower. That means that it only has the stamens on it. It's only the male type of flower. If it only has the pistils, we call it a pistillate flower. So make a note for that on page 35. So a pistillate flower, that's if it only has the female parts of the flower, or it's only a female type of flower. If it only has the stamen, then it is a staminate. I always heard it pronounced as staminate, but staminate is how your book pronounces it. Alright, anyone have any questions about this before we move on? Okay.
Can I call it staminate or staminate? Whichever one.
Your book technically wants to call it staminate, so we'll go with your book's pronunciation, but I always heard it pronounced staminate growing up, so occasionally I'll flip them, but we'll just go with your book's pronunciation since they've double checked it. Alright, good question though. Anyone else have any questions? Alright, so this is a pitch. Oh, anyone know what type of flower this is as a side note? You probably, I don't know if it has it in your book or not. I went and found flowers that I liked, so I don't know for sure if it's in the book or not. Okay?
The Japanese iris?
No!
A cactus one?
No! Because I don't know if it's in your book. I just went and got pictures of flowers that I knew that I liked.
I thought it was a cactus flower though.
Don't tell anybody yet.
It's a lily. So this is just a lily for it. Now, these flowers are known because they have a lot of pollen. If you were to touch a lily, for the lilies I get, they leave like orange streaks on my hand because of how much pollen that they're throwing off as much as possible for it. Now, if you're looking at this flower, we're just going to stick with this lily right here. Alright, so this is the pollen producing part right here. If you were to touch it, you would get orange, basically dust on your fingers. So if this is the pollen producing part, what part of the flower is it?
Stamen?
Okay, it is the male part. Help me. The anther, good job. So that's the pollen, so that is the pollen producing substance. It's making as much pollen typically as possible. This is why for the lilies in particular, some people might be allergic to lilies. How many of you know you're allergic to lilies? Okay, good. In a couple of years, whenever we do the flower dissections in biology, I bring lilies because lilies are the easiest ones to dissect. There was one year, one of my core students was allergic to it, and I didn't know it, and it was a rough day for them, and I felt bad. So that's why I always kind of check now to make sure. So because sometimes people are really allergic. Typically, if you're allergic to the flower, it's because of the pollen and the pollen dust. Not all the time, but that's typically the reason why. Okay.
How do you dissect the flower?
You cut it open. Your book tells you how on the next page. If you want to do it at home, we don't have time to do it. But if you want to do it at home and cut up a flower, now keep in mind the flower will be toast whenever you're done with it. It's going to be completely mangled. So it's part of the reason why they're expensive as well. Why your mom might not want you to cut up her flowers. So don't just go rummaging around in the yard and be like, I'm going to dissect this. No, check with mom first. So this is, okay, so this is the pollen producing part, so this is part of the stamen. What's the part that holds up the anther then? So you can look in your book if you want to cheat. Alright,
Filament.
good job. Alright, you can barely see it in this picture, the angle's kind of funky. This little knob portion right here is the sticky portion. Now it's not super sticky, but it's the idea that it's typically moist, sorry that word bothers you, so that way it helps kind of attract the pollen to it. So this is a little sticky portion. What specific part of the pistil is this?
Stigma.
Stigma. And then what's the portion that's holding it up? You can see it as it's the thicker kind of rod down here. So what's that part holding it up? Evie. Style. And then you can't see the ovaries and the down here because they are protected. They're the inside of the lilies down here, farther down. So this is one reason as to why the anther is held up so high and the stigma is held up so high. So that way whenever you have a pollinator come, hopefully it'll knock the pollen into the stigma so that way it can get pollinated or it can make the seeds that way from it. That's the reason why so many of these flowers, they try to hold up their pollen super high and they hold up their stigma super high to try to get the pollen knocked into it. Alright, anyone have any questions about this pig before we move on? Yes?
How, whenever you say it like makes the seeds, what does it do with the seeds?
What do you do with seeds? Why does a plant make seeds? What do you do with seeds if you don't eat them?
Well, I mean, if I know that it like drops it somehow, but how does it drop it if like the ovary's like down in here? How is it just like does it like poop it out?
No way. We'll talk about it later on, depending on the type of plant. Like, here's an example for the next one, because this question is coming up. Alright, what type of flowers are these? You can probably raise your hand, read you again. Scott got his hand up first. Dandelion! So you probably see a lot. Alright, this is what a dandelion flower looks like. Now, you might think, oh, this is the flower. That's the seeds. So, this is what the dandelion flower looks like. So once it gets pollinated, it makes a whole bunch of seeds. Because remember, the seeds are the baby plant. So the flower wants to, what has been pollinated, it wants to spread out its seeds as much as possible. That's why for this one, they have little bitty kind of like parachutes on them. So that way, whenever the wind blows, or whenever someone comes and takes them and blows them, it spreads out all the seeds as much as possible. That's the primary purpose of the flowers, is to get pollinated, so that way they can make the seeds. And that's the primary purpose of the flowers. They want to reproduce or make baby plants of their type for it. Okay.
I seen on a video the kid, instead of blowing one of them, that he ate it.
You can eat dandelions. You can actually eat, I don't know if you want to eat this part of it because that'd be kind of gross, but you can technically eat every part of a dandelion. It doesn't taste good.
No, he
but
ate the thing. I saw
Yeah, he-
video. He's like,
Mr. Ricker did a good kid last year.
Mr.
Mr. Ricker, the kid was going like this, and Mr. Ricker blew it and it went inside his mouth.
Gross. Okay, does anyone know why you try to wish off all, why you try to blow off all the seeds from them? Alright.
Because apparently to make a wish.
That's supposed to be, now again, it doesn't really work that way. How many of you have been able to blow off all the seeds before in one blow like how you're supposed to get a wish? It's hard, and depending on the type of dandelion, it might stick on a little bit harder. But again, this is kind of like a myth, or just kind of like a fun thing to do. But it's the idea. Wait. But it's the idea that as you blow on it, you get them all off, and supposedly your wish will be granted. So it's just one of those kind of fun things. Okay.
dandelions weeds?
Yeah, I mean, but if you like them, do you really care if the weeds are not in your yard? Yeah, so I mean, technically they'll grow by themselves and they get in the way of other plants. That's why people call them weeds, because they don't like them because they want to have nice plants. I like dandelions. Dandelions are some of my favorite flowers, so I don't mind having a whole bunch of dandelions in my garden. That's okay. Alright, so you can go ahead and move over to page 36 if you didn't do so already. We're going to skip reading this because it tells you how to do it if you want to do it. But keep in mind, check if your mom don't just start ripping up flowers over your yard, because your mom will probably not be happy. So, if you want to do it at home, you can, though, we just don't have time. Alright, page 37. So, there are two major processes that the plant has to have occur if it's going to make a seed. These are both vital, but they're different. Sometimes students think that they're one big step. No. Pollination is the transfer of pollen and getting the pollen to the stigma. Fertilization, that's whenever the sperm in the pollen and the egg cell and the ovary unite, and now you have a baby plant. So there are two different processes. Be careful, we'll talk through both of them, but a lot of cases students get them mixed up. Just because you have pollination doesn't mean you're going to automatically likely have fertilization. So just be careful as you're going through it. To make a note of both definitions, pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Could be on the same flower, could be in two different flowers. But it's the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Fertilization is the uniting of the sperm cell from the pollen grain with the egg cell in the ovary. Both pollination and fertilization are crucial in the reproductive cycle of a plant. It's also important because God designed it that only the same type of plant can fertilize itself. So, like for example, you can't have a lily and a rose pollinate each other. They are two different types of flowers. They don't work like that. Now, there's many different types of roses, and they can pollinate each other, and different types of lilies. They can pollinate each other. But you can't have the two different flowers pollinate each other. Their pollen grains are too different to where they won't pollinate, and then you can't get a baby plant that way from it. So your book's just pointing out that God designed it so that way, so you can only pollinate dandelions to dandelions, roses to roses, dogwoods to dogwoods, lilies to lilies. That way you can't have a mixing like that. Alright, and when I have a question about these two terms, we'll talk about them in detail. Alright, pollination. So pollinators, these are insects typically that go from flower to flower, and they are typically after the nectar on the inside. Honeybees is a major one. They go around collecting nectar. Now remember, why do honeybees want nectar? We talked about this loosely. Okay.
To make honey.
To make honey. Now honeybees also use the pollen. Anyone know why they need the pollen? You might have talked about this in 6th grade. Anyone know why they use it? Alright, they use it to also make a special type of food for the baby queens in the colony. So they feed them what's known as bee bread, and so they use the pollen to make it. So it's not like they're collecting tons of it, but they do take some of it with them as well. But they are coming mainly for the nectar. So do make a note of what nectar is. This is a sweet liquid usually stored at the base of the blossom. God designed it so the nectar is on the inside of the flower, so as the bee is going to get it, it has to bump into all of the anthers and get all the pollen all spread out. So that way it will try to increase the chances of the pollen landing on the stigma or getting stuck to the bee. Like this bee has a lot of pollen on his legs. He's collected a lot of it. So he'll go from flower to flower, and as he does that, he's bringing the pollen with him from flower to flower to flower. So he's having that transfer of the pollen from the anther to a stigma of another flower. Now they're not just bees, there can be other insects as well. Your book points out the pollinators that these could be moths, ants, bats, some birds as well, but we think of mainly insects like the honeybees. These are the major ones for us in the United States. Just depending on where you're at, there are other types of pollinators as well. How many of you have drunk nectar before? Nobody? Really?
Wait,
Lots
yeah.
of other things in it too. but-
Wait, are we talking about like honeysuckles?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
drinking. I was wondering, I was say, if you've ever gotten the honeysuckle and you pull out the base of it, no, you pull out the top and then you drink like the liquid, or you lick it, or you lick a little dewdrop off it, that's the nectar that you pulled off the flower
Yeah,
at
I've
that
eaten
point.
that.
So
Yes,
if
I've
you've
eaten
drunk that from a honeysuckle, then yes, that is the nectar. So hopefully all of you have done. How many of you have tried that before? Lana, you've never done that? I'm
Molly, you're
sorry.
missing out.
We need to find
I need a
something.
dandelion.
I
You've
have
never
a jack
tried it?
tub in my backyard.
I'm sorry. We need to try something at some point then. Alright, so just make a note, pollinators, and then nectar, make a note for those two things as well. Your book points out self-pollination and cross-pollination at this point. Self-pollination, that's whenever it gets pollinated by its own pollen, and that works for some flowers. That's all I need. As long as you have the pollen laying onto its own stigma, it's done at that point. It has the sperm cell and the egg cell, it can make its seeds now. Some flowers, they need it to come from a different flower, and that works as well. If it comes from a different flower, we call that cross-pollination. So make a note of that on page 37. This transfer of pollen from one flower to another is known as cross-pollination. So self-pollination, that's whenever the flower pollinates itself because an insect has bumped into it. Cross-pollination, that's whenever it gets it from a whole different flower and it pollinates it that way. So again, the terms make sense, but just be careful as you're going through it. Alright, who wants to read the brain bite at the top of the page? Alright, Hayden.
Because most pollen allergies come from wind-borne pollen grains, plants with bright, showy flowers, which are usually pollinated by insects, rarely called allergies.
Good job. So a lot of cases we see flowers like this, we go, that's where my allergies are coming from. And a lot of cases, no, because remember, flowers have those bright, showy petals to typically attract insects and to get their attention, kind of like waving a flag. They're trying to say, come here, come pollinate me. So that's how come they're trying to get attention that way. So a lot of cases, the bright, showy flowers, typically they're not pollinated by the wind. Some of them are, like the dandelions. The dandelions, they're not pollinated, but they're relying on the wind to help transfer or to help move their seeds. So a lot of cases, if you have a flower that relies on wind transfer of pollen, they don't need the bright, showy flowers because they don't need the insects to move their pollen. They need the wind to blow. So your book's just pointing out, in a lot of cases, not all the time, but in a lot of cases, if you're allergic to certain types of flowers, it's probably not the ones that have bright, showy petals. Typically, it's the wind-borne ones. Now, like I said, my poor previous student, this one is pollinated by insects. So also come it has the bright, showy flowers, but then my poor previous student was also allergic to it. So it's not all the time. So your book's just pointing out that typically, just because you see, wrong direction. Just because you see the bright flowers or you see all the pollen on it, doesn't mean you're automatically allergic to it. You're typically allergic to something that doesn't have the bright, showy flowers. Okay.
Your student that was allergic to it, did they just start sneezing or?
Yeah, like their eyes started watering and their nose started pouring snot, and it was really bad. I asked them if they needed to go to like the office and just wait till the class was over because I felt so bad for them. And the student was like, no, I'll do it. So that student just shoved tissue up their nose and then proceeded to dissect the flower. It was a girl. So I was like, I'm sorry, so and so. I'm very sorry. I will check next time. But
who was it?
Again, I'm not telling you.
How big is
Do we know who it was?
I don't know. Alright, we gotta keep going though. Alright, we gotta keep going.
Was it
Alright,
here?
we gotta keep going. We gotta keep going. Alright, so pollinators, different types of insects, typically, but they can be other things as well for it. They pollinate or transfer the pollen. Alright, we're gonna watch a quick video about it. Now this video is a little bit juvenile, but they do a good job explaining, which is why I like it for it. You may get the
No, he's the one who said woohoo, not me.
I'm sorry, you were clapping your hands. I thought you were doing it.
Oh.
Excuse me. Alright, so this video is a little bit juvenile, but it's still a good video. It gets the point across for it. Dr. Happy, take it away.
Hi, my name is Dr. Mia Park. Have you thanked a bee today? If you haven't, you really should, because bees and other pollinators are responsible for much of the food we eat. Did you know that 90% of flowering plants rely to some degree on animal pollinators? Or that many of our favorite foods need pollinators to produce? So who are these important animal pollinators? Well, a pollinator is any animal that moves pollen successfully from plant to plant. The best pollinators are highly mobile. In fact, most of them fly. The more flowers that a pollinator can get to in a day, the more pollination can happen. Most other pollinators visit flowers for nectar, but bees are actively collecting pollen because for a bee, pollen is baby food. Bee plants have brightly colored flowers, like blue, yellow, and orange, that bees can see clearly against a background of green foliage. Not only are bees amazing pollinators, they're the most common pollinators of our agricultural and wild plants. So if we lose bees, we lose a lot of our flowering plants too. But while bees are critically important, they're not the only pollinators. Did you know that bats are the major pollinators of bananas, mangoes, cacao, and guava? Nocturnal bats prefer white flowers that are easier to locate in the dark. Many birds around the world are nectivorous, and they make great pollinators. Hummingbirds are the ones that we're most familiar with. Like the other nectar feeders, most of them have very long beaks and tongues to reach the hidden nectar. So now we have a clear idea of why plants need animal pollinators, but how do they get those animals to do their work? The most important and common rewards found in flowers are food in the form of sugary, rich nectar and protein-rich pollen. Animals have come to rely on these rewards as part of their diet. Flowers cater to the way different animals sense the world. If you were a pollinator, would you be more likely to look for a single flower or a whole patch of flowers? Of course, you'd go for the whole patch of flowers because you'd be more likely to find more flowers with nectar there. Many plants need pollinators to reproduce successfully, and we need them for our healthy fruits and vegetables. You can be a pollination biologist too. Use what you know about how different pollinators perceive the world to start predicting who visits what flower.
Okay, a little bit juvenile, but it got its point across. It's helped showing pollinators and showing why they're important. Alright, Hayden, you can slide again. Alright, yes, Jared.
What's juvenile?
Means it's a little bit childish. So more for like elementary. But I mean, it works. It does its job, and I liked it. Alright, so anyone have any questions about this before we move on? Alright, next page. Or it kind of starts in this page and with the result of pollination. So, kind of getting into it with fertilization. So we're going to talk through the terms, and then I'll show you the diagram. If you want to look at the diagram on page 47 as I talk about it, that's fine as well. So, fertilization. This is whenever you have the sperm cell in the pollen and the egg cell in the ovary actually unite at this point. This is whenever you have fertilization. So, the pollen has to already be on the stigma. Once you have the pollen on the stigma, that's whenever a pollen tube starts to grow down from the pollen grain. So it tells you on this page, on page 37, pollen tube begins to grow, and then it flips over into the next page. So the pollen tube begins to grow from the pollen's location on the stigma, and it travels down the style into the ovary. Because remember, we're talking about stigma, style, and ovary. This is the female part of the plant. What's the name for the female part of the plant? Wait, raise your hand. Yes, pistil. Good job. So, you have the pollen tube going down on the inside of the style. Now, the sperm cell on the inside of the pollen grain, it has to go down and has to fertilize or unite with the egg cell on the inside of the ovary. Plants is actually kind of interesting because remember, a sperm cell, this is just the male reproductive cell that actually divides and forms two of them. This is technically called double fertilization. You don't have to know that right now, but your books, I'm just pointing it out to you. That the sperm cell, that there's technically two of them whenever the sperm cell goes down. One of them unites with the egg cell, the other one makes the food for the baby plant as it's developing later on for it. But your book's just pointing it out for you. Once you have the egg cell on the inside of the ovary unite with the sperm cell, I'm going to make a note of what an egg cell is. The egg cell is the female reproductive cell in the ovule, which is inside the ovary. Once you have the sperm cell and the egg cell unite, they unite together to form an embryo. This is a term we use for a baby. So a baby plant is what this is referring to. So the embryo, which is the beginning of the new plant. So just make a note that you have the sperm cell and the egg cell unite, you get an embryo. So looking over here at this picture again for it, this picture is a little bit easier to see. Now, keep in mind that these are the anther and the filament, so parts of the stamen. Now remember, which one makes pollen, Glenn? Good job. So this one's making the pollen. So here's the stigma, style, and ovary. So this is part of the pistil, or the female parts of the plant. So once you have the pollen grain land at the top of the stigma, it starts to go down to create that pollen tube, goes all the way down, 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 finally gets inside the ovary with the ovule, and that's whenever it unites with the ovules on the inside. You have the egg cells of the ovule. So that's whenever you actually have an embryo or a baby plant. So you have the uniting of the sperm cell and the egg cell on the inside. Your book, try to show you with the pictures over how it works, but I have a moving diagram to help it be a little bit easier as well. Sometimes that helps students be able to see it. It makes it a little bit easier for them. Oops, wrong one. There it is. So, pollen grain, so this one's a wind-blown pollen grain, just for example's sake, so it's just showing it to you. So it has to get eventually to the stigma of the same type of flower, the stigma, style, and ovary. So since it's showing you stigma, style, and ovary, what is this whole structure called? And raise your hand, Danielle.
Huh? Pistil?
Pistil, good job, making sure you're following along. So the pollen tube grows out, now it's not this fast, it's just showing you, okay, how quick, it's just showing you, just different parts, it does not go down that quickly for us. So make the pollen tube. And then you have the sperm cell that goes down, it technically divides into two of them. And so one of them fertilizes or unites with the egg cell while the other one makes the food for the baby embryo.
So the pollen just carries the sperm cell?
That's part of the reason as to how come the plant makes so much pollen, because they have to get one of the pollen grains to the stigma of the same type of flower. That's why it basically throws its pollen into the air or tries to attract insects, because what happens if the pollen isn't going to make it to another stigma of the flower? What's going to happen?
You're not gonna have any seeds.
You're not going to have any seeds. What happens if you don't have any seeds at the time of plant?
No more plant.
And then what's going to happen?
No more humans.
Okay, yes, eventually. But it would be the idea, yes, of that particular type of flower or plant, they would all die. You wouldn't get the baby seeds. You wouldn't get the embryos from them. So that's how they're designed to basically throw their pollen out as much as possible, or try to attract insects with nectar to come pollinate, because that's the only way to get a baby plant or an embryo is to have the pollen unite with the stigma, or specifically to have the sperm cell on the inside of the pollen unite with the egg cells on the inside of the ovule. So, once you have the fertilized egg cell, it's called a embryo. Technically, zygote, if you want to get super specific, but embryo just means baby, or it's a type, or it's a word we use to refer to a baby. So just make a note for that. So this is a baby plant or an embryo. Alright, anyone have any questions about this? Yes.
Can I watch it again? It's really short.
Yeah.
But without pausing.
Okay. It's like 40 seconds. Pollen grain flows through the air for this particular type of flower, for this example. Then the stigma and the style and the ovary part of pistil, pollen tube forms. Sperm from the pollen goes down the pollen tube. Technically there's two of them. Awfully long pause there.
Just lotion.
Raise your hand? I couldn't hear you. Yes, it is.
I said it looked really weird when it was like darker and it looked like the sperm cells with like the eyes of the pollen and it looked like the mouth.
It just kind of look kind of creepy sometimes. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're just trying to show it. Sometimes the pictures don't make a whole lot of sense, but they're trying the best they can for it.
It's like a cartoon.
So they're trying to help you out, because sometimes it's helpful to be able to see it and to see it going through that way for it. Alright. Now we can go a little bit farther for it. We all are doing good today. And then we'll stop and we'll play review games because we covered a lot of information today. I want to make sure we're getting through enough of it. Alright, so seed growth. Alright, so each seed is a powerful growth package with three main parts. There's the embryo. Now remember, what's the embryo? Yeah. Okay, so it's the baby plant basically. So embryo, baby plant. So it has the embryo, it has the endosperm. Make a note of what the endosperm is. That's the stored part. That is the stored food. That's what the second sperm cell did. So it helps make that extra food for it. And it has a seed coat, which helps protect it. Basically, kind of like a shell in some cases. Sure to sit up there, good. Now, whenever you have the sperm cell unites with the egg, it results in the embryo or the miniature plant. It's made up of two parts for it. It has a plumule and a radicle. So these are two parts of the embryo. So make a note for that one. The radicle develops into the root system. So you didn't think radicle starts with an R, root system starts with an R. Remember, why are the roots important to a plant?
Because they get the water out of the ground and
Okay.
the nutrients.
Yep, that's part of it. What's going to happen though if you get all the roots chopped off?
It's gonna die.
Why?
Because it doesn't have any nutrients and because it's not getting good for it.
What else is going to happen to it? Jaden?
It holds the plant in place and the plant's gonna just blow away and die.
Yeah, it's also come if you have an area where there's not a lot of dirt for a tree to grow in, then that's probably the reason why trees can't grow there. Do you all know what permafrost is? I know this is not related to like this right this second. Does anyone know what permafrost is? Okay?
It's like it's frost is permanent. Well, it's like water. It's where it's like super wet and soggy.
No. Based on that. Okay, Evie? Oh, I'm sorry. Alright, anyone else think we know what permafrost is? Okay. Yeah, so it's not just frost at the top of the ground, it's the ground deeper. It's permanently frozen. Typically it's about 2 feet down below the surface. So the top part of the ground might not be frozen. This is typically way up north, like high up in Canada or in Alaska or farther up than that. You'll hit areas where there's permafrost, where it's so cold the ground never thaws out basically. since you only have about 2 feet of soil, tree roots can't really grow there very well because trees need longer than 2 feet of soil to grow in properly. Otherwise, they're just gonna fall over. So in a lot of areas like high up north, you don't have a lot of trees because they don't have enough ground for them to grow. So that's how come the roots are important. Not just for water, which yes, they are important for water. But they also help anchor like the trees in so that way they can stand out tall and get really, really tall. If that root system isn't there, they can fall over. Okay.
Couldn't the willow tree grow there? Because I saw a picture and like they don't only go down for a few feet and then they slow this way.
It depends on whether, I think for the willow tree specifically, if it's that high north, it also could just get too cold to where the trees just don't survive there. And then also in areas like Alaska and really far up north places, remember they have about 6 months of constant sunlight and then 6 months of constant darkness because they're so high up. Most trees can't survive.
Couldn't
in
we
that
make like a
environment.
light that?
You could, I guess if you decided this tree will live, you can make it survive there. Because that's what greenhouses do basically, is they take plants that only live in tropical areas and they make them live in other areas. So I guess if you wanted to and you decided that you as a human are gonna make this tree, you're gonna make sure that it lives and it survives, then yeah, I guess you could for it. Like, I try to make my plants survive, but my plants try very hard to not survive. But I decide as a human I'm going to do my best to do it. Okay,
My uncle used to live in Alaska.
that's fun.
Yes, they had like 4 dogs, so their dogs loved it.
It's really pretty up in Alaska. It's cold, which is why I'm not
Did you
a
live
fan
in
of it, but it's pretty.
I lived in a house, but it had 40 years.
Alright, so radicle develops into the root system. Plumule, make a note for this one that the plumule, that becomes the shoot system or it becomes the stem and the leaf. So there are 2 parts of the embryo. Make a note for them. Alright, do make a note though that it also has 1 or 2 cotyledons. These are structures designed for food absorption and storage. We'll talk more about them tomorrow because I'm going to run out of time. And it also has, the cotyledons absorb stored food from the endosperm and the seed coat protects it. So we will come back to this though because I'm going to run out of time and I want to make sure I review. Alright, you can go ahead and take out a piece of paper so we can write down stuff you don't know. Since we didn't review at the beginning of class, we're going to review at the end. So we hopefully get you start thinking about it. I know we covered a whole lot of terms today. I know we're doing good. Alright, so we're going to do just the palm game. So first person just to raise your hand, just answer the question. You want to know the parts of the flower really well. Alright, yes, Jaden. Wait, do you have a question? Can you wait 6 minutes? Because class is about to be over.
I can eat it.
No, not during class. Not during class.
Well, if I don't, can I clean the floor?
No, not if you throw during class, you get a demerit.
What?
Yeah, so after class, if you throw and if you miss, you get to clean my floor. But if it's during class and you throw, demerit removed. Okay.
They actually, when they lived in Alaska, they actually had like 6 or 7 trees where they lived.
It depends on where you're at in Alaska. In the lower portions of it, you
Yeah,
can
they
have
lived
stuff.
in the lower.
But yeah, if you go way up higher, like high up in Alaska, you're gonna start hitting the permafrost or the tundra area. So again, depends on where you live at. Alright, so prefer to raise your hand, just answer the question. Alright, so what do we call just the female parts of the flower? So I'm just waiting for my guys to go. So, female parts of the flower, what do we just call it? Not specifically the parts yet, just what do we call this female part of the flower? Go. That was too early, Scott. Alright. Pistil. Alright, what is the top part that's typically, you can think of it as light sticky, but it's not always super sticky. Go.
Glue. Stain.
What?
Stain.
That was a good guess, but not quite. Alright, Danielle.
Stigma.
Stigma. So stigma, sticky. Help me remember that way. Alright, what do we call the stick part or the rod part that helps hold up the stigma? Remember, this is still part of the female part of the flower. Go. That was good. That's the style. Alright, and then what do we call the bottom portion of the flower that contains the egg? So it contains the ovule, so don't say ovule. But what do we call the bottom portion down here? Go. Okay, I think that was wrong. Ovary. So those are the 3 parts of the pistil. Alright, now we're talking about the male reproductive structures. What do we call the male reproductive structures? Go. Stamen, good job. What do you call the part that makes the pollen will, and then all of a sudden you're going somewhere else.
Antha. And he's giving me. I'm getting really close.
What's your final answer? I'll see if someone gets closer than that.
Antherin.
Let's see if someone can get closer. Alright, I believe Danielle was next.
Anthem?
Anthem? Nope. Alright, Lana's next and then Hayden.
Amber.
Anther. You changed it. You said it and then you changed your mind. An anthropod, that's an insect basically. So anther. Anther.
Shut up.
Okay, that's an arachnid.
Oh wait, yeah, that's like a grasshopper.
Loser.
Alright, technically Lana, because Lana got it. Alright, let's
What's it called?
Anther. Anther.
Anther.
Anther. A-N-T-H-E-R. Okay. Let's see. Oh, what's the part that holds up the anther? So remember, it's not the style. Style is part of the pistol. So what is holding up the anther? Go.
Helmet?
What?
Helmet?
Helmet. Ready. Not too loud.
Can you just hit it
Nope.
instead of raising our hand?
No, because I'm looking for the motion. The motion I'm looking for. Alright, what do we call the bright, showy portion of the flower? This is hopefully the easiest part. So this is the part you notice and you see. Go. I think it was Glenn.
Of course it was.
What? Petals.
Petals.
Alright, what do you call the portion down here that helps protect the developing flower? And then sometimes they're still there. What do we call that portion that helps protect it? I don't know if everybody. Go. It was easy. Sorry? Nope, not rectangle. You're thinking of this portion down here, the base of it. Alright? Alright, let me go say it. Okay. Sepal. So sepal. Alright, what do you call the base of the flower? It's not rectangle, but you have kind of an idea close to it. It sounds close to that. But it's not rectangle.
Oh!
Be sure to write down all the terms in it if you're not participating. So you're right or you're participating. That's your options. Go. I think it was video.
Rectangle?
Nope.
Repticle?
Nope.
Rectangle?
Nope. Nope. Okay, you can't keep guessing.
Tentacle.
Nope.
I don't know.
What? Nope. Alright, but that's one guess?
No.
Alright, write it down then. Receptacle.
I was
One of you were
so
close. Receptacle. 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 Make a note for that one. What do you call a flower if it only has the female parts? What do you call if it only has just the pistil, so it doesn't have the stamen? So what do we call it if it only has the pistils? And that's it.
What?
Go. That was on. If it only has the pistil.
Pistol.
Okay, you're getting too much. Stop.
Wait, pistol?
Pistillate.
You should only give them one.
I give you a hint. Alright, what is the type of flower that has just the male portion of the flowers? Go. Cheater. Alright, give me. Good job, stamina. Let's see. Oh, what do you call the type of flower, like if you're talking about the ovary, if it's above the other flower parts? What do we call that? You have 50-50 shot basically of guessing this one if you know what I'm talking about. Go. That was Jaden. Superior. Alright, go ahead and add up your points really quick because it's almost out of time and I need to give you your homework so I don't forget. Alright, anyone have 3 or more? Alright, Lana, Lynn, don't forget your candy. Go and take out your sun pad. Alright, you're going to read pages 38 through 40. Read pages 38 through 40. Answer on page 41. Questions 6 through 8, and thought provoker. So read pages 38 through 40. Answer page 41. Questions 6 through 8, and thought provoker. Alright, every day, what did it do? One and two or what?
Have we already
It's
done
not
1 through 5?
No, but because you didn't have homework last night. Alright, Glenn, I told me you have homework.
Oh, I can't find your room. So it's just 6 through 8.
6 through 8 and have homework.
I can't find your room. Go through all of it.
Alright. This is the first time this has happened. Cleaning too, you both help me clean after school. Alright, so this is the first time that it happened that you showed me today outside of the homework fence, but you have to have it done before the start of class.
Mona,
What?
I like cleaning, but I don't like cleaning my room.
Question 24.
Mrs.
Mr.
I like cleaning, but I don't want to clean my room. I like cleaning everything